Hello, everyone. This is Alice Caldermark. Welcome. Thank you for joining again. A couple of you are joining again for the second time because you had to drop off sooner than expected yesterday, but welcome to those that are joining us for their initial listen in on the BIA's fatal flaws. So this is Alice Caldermark, President of Continuity Planner. God, I can't even say our own name. Continuity Professionals of Ohio, otherwise known as CPO. Thank you for joining. We're happy to welcome the William Travis Group to host this webinar today. They've graciously agreed to do this for us. I'll give you a little bit of background about who William Travis Group is, what we're going to talk about, and cover just a few housekeeping items before I turn it over to Bill to take us through the presentation. The William Travis Group was founded in 1990. They have over 25 years in the business of business continuity. They're industry leaders in disaster recovery, business continuity, and all risk management, incident management. They're authors of the only next-generation DRBC methodology and viable alternative to the BIA. Today's presentation is going to cover the BIA's fatal flaws. In this presentation, we'll be learning the 10 reasons a traditional BIA is incomplete, beneficial for businesses of all sizes, any industry, public or private sectors. And the question at the end of the day is how can you do things differently? So I'm going to challenge each of you as you listen to what Bill has to share with us today, that you take this and look at it and see, how can I apply this to my program today and improve my program? So this is, the intent is to provoke your thoughts and to get you thinking about different ways that you can continue to improve your program and make it better and more dynamic and meet the needs of your business as it is today and be relevant going forward. So keep your eyes and ears open and keep an open mind about what you hear, and be ready to ask questions at the end of the presentation so that we can challenge Bill. He loves having a good question thrown at him, which I'll probably do once or twice as we step through the presentation. Mr. Bedsole has personally consulted with hundreds of organizations. He's built and managed the world's largest commercial hotspots, and he's introduced the first structured DRBC methodology in the Canada, UK, Europe, and Pacific Rim markets. We will be taking a recording this session, and actually it's going to be blended with a recording from yesterday's session, so you get the best of both sessions. It will be made available on the CPO website, as well as I know that WTG William Travis Group will be hosting it on their website as well. What we are going to do, though, is ask that if you have any questions, that you go ahead and enter them in the chat window that's here on our WebEx, and send it as a private chat to Jody Davis-Curlis, our VP of CPO. She'll be monitoring the questions and bring them up at the end of the session. We're doing this so that we can keep the presentation flowing and allow plenty of time to handle your questions and have challenge Bill with some really tough questions. So that'll be going on. Like I said, I'll probably interject a couple of times as we step through the presentation, because I've had the luxury of seeing this and I've had a few questions, so I like to ask Bill to help me understand and how I can take this information and apply it to my business. So you'll hear me a couple of times, but for everybody else, we ask that you submit your questions in the chat window, and we'll cover those at the end of the session. Once we've completed the Q&A, for those that can stay on and would like to, Bill's going to take us through a demonstration of AREMBA, which is WTG's product that they promote to that supports what they're going to present to us today. So you've heard me talk enough. I'm going to now turn it over to Mr. Bill Bedsole. It's all yours, Bill.
Alice, thank you so much. That was a great intro. Folks, thanks for joining us. I'm going to do a very little bit of flag waving here at the front end, 2 slides, and then we're going to focus on the fatal flaws. As Alice said, we're a consulting firm. We're a pure consulting firm, meaning I don't sell hot sites or replication or that. We work with our clients to get them recoverable, okay? But I think we do it very differently. At least we try to do it very differently. As Alice said, we're the only guys out there, as far as I know, with a next-generation methodology, which always scares me a little to say that. As far as I know, we're the only ones out there with an all-risk incident management methodology. We have a completely different approach for the quality, completeness, usability, maintainability of our plan, to the point, and this is part of our alternative to the BIA, is we can actually create your plan at time of disaster on the fly for the disaster of the moment. Do a lot of tabletop exercises, and we do that differently. They're very realistic, very immersive. Do a lot of solutioning, and for those organizations that have everything in place and they think it's everything they need it to be, we'll do an impartial third-party assessment. We call it CPR. Benchmark your program against a half a dozen international standards and say, here's the good, here's the bad, and here's where you should focus a little more effort. So with that, ARIMBA, the next generation alternative to a BIA. We're going to start with the BIA. Why does an organization typically want to do a BIA? Well, to identify financial losses caused by process interruption, to use those losses to get management's commitment. Commitment's also spelled spending. Okay? To identify your recovery priorities, to get the business side as opposed to IT to own the problem, and to define how many people and resources are needed. Now, we're not interactive here, but take a look at that list and see if your reason for wanting to do a BIA is on that list. Most of the time it is, because I think this is, in fact, and there's always a lot of reasons, but these reasons, I think, are the key reasons organizations want to do a BIA. Now, the catch is, I think these are all the wrong reasons. Okay? And as we go through today, I'm going to see if I can maybe convince you of that, and then at the end, we'll talk about what the right reasons are. So, without any further ado, the 10 fatal flaws of a BIA. And there's probably hundreds of them, okay? But these are the ones we're going to talk about today. We're going to go through each one. I'm going to tell you why I think they're fatal flaws, what they do to hamper the BIA process, and maybe what you can do to prevent the problem. So for the very beginning, BIAs were invented for the wrong reason. And unfortunately, 30-plus years later, they're still kind of carrying that baggage. And the reason they were invented was, at the time, literally every single prospect we sat down with to talk about commercial hot sites, their first question was, wait, before we go any further, tell me, how can I recover my data center in this hot site? We are so much bigger than you. Well, we needed a logical answer, and that logical answer was, well, because you're not going to recover everything, you're only going to recover the most critical things. And as soon as we said that, you can think what the next question was. The next question was, well, how do we know what's the most critical? Well, you conduct a BIA. So that's why BIAs were invented. And like I say, it was a self-serving reason. And it would be okay if it was invented for that reason, and 30 years later it became a different reason. But unfortunately, that baggage is still being carried around. The next problem with BIAs is BIAs, more often than not, organizations are trying to do a BIA to estimate the losses of process interruptions so they can go to management and get management's commitment. I think that's a fundamental problem. Now, I've tried over the years to estimate losses. I've seen probably hundreds of BIA examples where other organizations have tried to estimate losses, and I don't think it's possible. Matter of fact, I think it's impossible to estimate financial losses of process interruption. But for our discussion today, let's assume you can estimate it. And let's say not only can you estimate it, but you can estimate it to the penny and to the minute. And you can tell me where on this curve, now this is kind of a commercial example, but you'll all get the gist of this. Where on this curve, from when the disaster occurs to infinite time, where on the curve will you irritate a customer or a client? To where would you lose an order? Again, kind of a retail kind of thought process, but you'll get the concept. To where you lose that customer forever. And again, if you could tell me to the penny and to the minute when that would happen, then I'd say, what about your next most important customer? And your next important customer? And every one's going to have a different answer. And we haven't begun to talk about how often is a disaster going to occur? What's the likelihood of it happening? If it happens, how long is it going to last? Because a one-day disaster isn't anywhere near as bad as a one-month disaster. And we haven't even started talking about what's the impact scenario, when did it happen, and is you the only ones that are down, or is the whole supply chain down, and is it regional, and on and on and on and on and on. And every one of those permutations has a different answer as to what your losses are going to be. Okay? So I think
Bill,
that's problematic. Yeah.
A question for you here.
Okay.
When I'm looking through this, how does this strategy help me translate risk impacts into the C-suite language that will resonate so that we can effectively cause action within our organizations?
Well, like this slide says, I think your first point and your first objective is to not create a resistive mindset by pushing financial losses that management, I don't think, fundamentally believes. Okay. From there, if we acknowledge that your management understands their business, okay, and if we paint for them an accurate, incontrovertible picture of process interruption, cross-process dependency, process criticality as a function of time, resource requirements to conduct processes, that does not overestimate the importance of those processes, isn't self-serving to our mission, quote unquote. Every time I've seen that happen, management gets it, and once management gets it, they accept it. And I don't think anything else is needed. On the other hand, when you try and put numbers to it, every time I've seen that happen, management resists that, and that's where I see those arguments and that lack of support starting.
Thank you, Bill.
Okay, you're welcome. That's a good question. Thank you. The next fatal flaw is probability is not predictable, okay? You know, you see stats out there that a typical company will experience a disaster 1 in every 5 years or 1 in every 10 years. The unfortunate nature of probability is, well, let's say that's a perfectly accurate estimate. Once every 10 years, you'll have a disaster. That disaster could happen this afternoon as well as 10 years from now, okay? And again, we haven't talked about the duration and do you get any warning? Can you foresee this coming? How often is it going to happen? When does it happen? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I think going down the path of trying to predict the likelihood of your disaster events is as fatalistic as predicting the financial impact of your events. Next. Next couple here are going to get a little tricky, so you got to keep your eye on this. Most BIAs do not weigh process criticality within a tier, but I argue it must be weighed within a tier. Now, what does all that mean? Well, let's say we've got a process that looks like this, you know, whatever, some amount of impacts, legal in this example, life safety, financial, image, and they're rated some level. Now, some BIAs will say they're severe, significant, inconvenient, critical. Some will call it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Whatever it is, there's a scale. Okay? And let's say there's another process that has different impacts at different levels. But the tier that I'm talking about is the severe tier or the number 4 tier or whatever it is. Most BIAs will say these are equal. I have 2 severe processes. In reality, they're not equal, okay? And if you put a weighting scale to it, it becomes very obvious that they're not equal. So you say, well, why do I care? You care because the one thing that you can guarantee and depend on in a disaster is that you will be caught unsuspected. No matter how well you plan, something is going to catch you off guard. So let's say that your plan was these were both severe processes and you were going to recover both these severe processes at a certain time frame, and you had all the resources you needed to do that, so there should be no problem. But plans don't go as planned, and at time of disaster, the resources you need to recover both these processes, they're not available. So on the fly, you need to make a decision. Where do I allocate my resources? Do I allocate it to this process or this process? If all you know is they're both severe, you can't make a choice. So your BIA didn't help you. If your alternative to the BIA says this is a severe 36, just a label, versus a severe 47, this one's clearly more important. Allocate your resources to this one first. Okay? BIAs don't help you with that kind of time of disaster decision making. Similarly, process criticality across tiers is often weighted by a BIA, but it can't be. So let's take a different process and say it's got different kinds of impacts and compare it to another process that has no legal impact, no life safety impact, no financial impact, but a critical image impact. Typically, a BIA is going to say, you know, one way or the other, it's going to count the money bags or count the impacts, or somehow it's going to say all these severes are more important than this one image critical. But that's not true. Okay? In reality, a critical impact, be it 1 or 1,000 different categories, a critical impact is more important than any number of severe impacts. Okay? BIAs mostly have that backwards, and once again, that's problematic. Okay? Now, the next problem, similar look, but a different issue. Criticality must aggregate across locations. So let's say I have a process 1. And I have process 2. And as we just said, this is not as important as this one critical process. But let's add to it process 1 in location 2 and process 1 in location 3. And let's say our planning said we're never going to lose both of these processes at all 3 locations. Maybe we say that because these 3 locations are 10,000 miles apart. Or maybe we say that, you know, we have completely different people and different applications that support it, and just they'll never go down. But again, lo and behold, at some reason or another, despite your best plans, you lost that process at all locations. There is no built-in redundancy. What's the situation now? Is process 1 still less important than this one critical process? I can't tell you that. My alternative to a BIA can't tell you that. But what my alternative can do is it can give you a flashing red light when this happens and says, you didn't plan for this, you didn't prioritize your BIA results based on this, but you better figure it out now because this is what you're dealing with. Okay? BIAs don't help you with that. There's no flashing red lights in a traditional BIA. Very similar, okay, same process. We would say this one's less critical, but now let's talk about dependencies. So we have process 3 and process 4, and you look and say, oh, they're unrelated processes, so process 1's still less important. However, let's add the fact that process 3 and process 4 are dependent on process 1 and vice versa. So when I lost process 1, I've also lost process 3 and 4, again, despite my best planning efforts. Are all 3 severe processes still less important than one critical? I can't tell you, but I can warn you, okay? And that warning allows you to gather your resources, make your decisions, figure out what's going down, what you do have and what you don't have, what's going according to plan and what's not, when did the disaster occur, how bad is it, are other people in the same boat, and make your decision. BIAs don't help with that. And the last in the flow, okay, start the same concept, okay? I have different processes, but they're all dependent on a single common resource. In this case, I just showed application 1. Are all 3 processes that are lost when I lose application 1 still less important than this one? Don't know. But despite the fact that application 1 is a high availability application with synchronous replication and continuous availability, and I should never, ever lose it, I lost it. And when I lost it, I lost 3 processes, not 1. Now, none of them are critical, but in aggregate, how do they compare to the one critical? you've got to decide before you can go forward. Okay.
So, Bill?
Yeah.
I'm going to interject one more question here.
Okay.
I see what you're saying, but at the end of the day, how does this approach address identifying those key risks for the organization?
Well, again, like we said before, management inherently understands their business. Now, they may not understand it in the terms that a BIA talks about. They may not be familiar with disaster recovery and business continuity, but they usually understand their business, okay? So if you talk to them about their business processes and the detailed view of that process criticality and how that process deteriorates over time and what the ripple effect of cross-process interruption is, and if you can show them that graphically and clearly and without bias, they'll understand the risks, and they'll understand them in the terms that are meaningful to them as opposed to maybe my terms or the BIA's terms of severe, critical, level 4, RTOs, and they may not get those things, but they'll understand what's important. And when you go to them with this picture, not literally this picture, but this concept, and talk about the interdependencies of these three processes and what it means, and are those three more important, they'll get it, as long as you have the information to show them and to defend the position.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Also, just as an example again, if we have a weighting scale, we can apply that weighting scale, which makes it that much clearer. You take 914 plus 1600 is 2500 and 37-ish versus 28-ish, it becomes pretty clear. And if you say, how did these things get weighted like this, and you talk about the rating scales, and they do, and you really only have to do this once. They get it, they trust it, they believe it. Next time it happens, they'll look at that and say, oh, geez, 3800 is way over 2800. I know which way to go. Flaw number 6. The BIA is based on the wrong solution curve. Now, I may be the father of this problem. As far as I know, I'm the guy who drew this picture the first time many, many years ago. At the time, it seemed real simple. The faster you can recover, the more expensive that capability is. Conversely, the longer you're down, the more you're going to lose. So theoretically, we were looking for that Goldilocks effect, the sweet spot in the middle that said just the right amount of protection for just the right amount of loss. However, maybe even back then it wasn't true, but certainly today it isn't true. First of all, it's not a nice even curve. It's a staircase, and it's a very uneven staircase. And there's not a sweet spot. There's a sweet spot in every one of those treads. Okay, what does that mean to you? Well, it means if you're down here, and let's say we define that tread as, however you want to define it, one-day recovery, recovery of an application on a shared server, whatever it is. Or you define this as 1 hour recovery or high availability on dedicated hardware, the curve seems to infer that as you move up or down, it's just a little incremental difference. And it's not. To move from this tier to this tier can be an order of magnitude. This, for a given server, may cost you $50 a month. This may cost you $5,000 a month. For a given process, this may cost you $500 a month to be able to recover that process in a day. To recover it in an hour, it could cost $50,000. So the BIA does a disservice kind of inferring that nice smooth curve. The next problem is kind of related, and that is BIAs are kind of gross estimates in most cases, and unfortunately, close isn't close enough. So let's say, for example, you do a BIA, and it says the RTO for this whatever, be it a process or an application, is 7 days. And it leaves you there, and you work on 7 days. The problem with that is that being on that 7-day tier is going to cost you an order of magnitude more than being on this tier. So if you can go back to that process owner and say, tell me again, why do you need 7 days? What would be the downside if it was 8 days instead of 7? we find that about 65+% of the time when we have that second level discussion, they're willing to move back. And every time we move back, it saves money and time of disaster operational complexity. So we have in our process what we call RTO outliers, warning lights that say, you're right on the cusp. Have another 5 or 10-minute discussion and maybe you can change it. If you do, you save money. By the way, going back to the question, management starts believing that you're doing these things, believing that you're pushing back, believing that you're saving money, they believe you too. Similar but conversely, the BIA says, okay, I need 8-day recovery. Well, the way most recovery tiers work is that if you're on this tier, you can come up in 8 to 14 days. You're not guaranteed 8 days. And if this requirement was absolutely, positively must have in 8 days or the world is going to end, you want to go back to them and have the opposite discussion, say, maybe we should talk about being a little more aggressive and bumping you up a tier. It's going to be more expensive, but it's guaranteed 7 days, quote unquote guaranteed. Okay? BIAs don't deal with outliers. Okay. Flaw number 8, the business will make up the difference. This is a really ugly one. Most BIAs, it goes back to that first problem, why it was invented. They still carry this luggage of whether it's overt or not, whether it's specified or not, they're trying to define the smallest disaster recovery footprint. Maybe it's to convince management because it's the cheapest approach. Maybe it's just because of their good intent. But when you define the smallest disaster recovery capability, meaning the IT capability, by definition, that leaves the biggest overhead and impact for the business to pick up because of the tremendous dependency on IT. Okay? The less that IT recovers, the slower they recover, the more the business has to make up for it. Our approach doesn't look for that minimum IT recovery capability. We look for the optimal IT recovery capability. Now, admittedly, that's usually a little more expensive, but it reduces dramatically the overhead on the business. And when you look at the total cost of one approach versus the other, the optimal DR capability with a minimal business overhead is much, much less expensive, much less complicated than what a traditional BIA generally points you to. Okay. Flaw number 9, RTO is a dinosaur. If you get a good BIA, assuming there's a thing called a good BIA, it will give you a process RTO, recovery time objective. When does this process need to come back? And it will give you an application RTO. When does this application need to come back? Sounds good, very flexible. Problem is, it's about 25 years out of date, okay? You definitely need the process RTO. You definitely need an application RTO, but you need it by process because different processes that use the same application have different requirements for that application's RTO. You need to know the maximum application RTO for all the processes that use that application. What's the most aggressive requirement? You need the IT application RTC, the actual capability, not the objective. You need to know about those outliers that we just talked about. You need the weighted application criticality and the cumulative application criticality and the application recovery group and the application recovery sequence at a minimum. And this is typically what a BIA will give you. Flaw number 10, the devil is the details. So kind of back to that last point. A good BIA will give you, I don't know, a half a dozen, 6, 7, 8 data points, RTO, RPO, recovery tier, recovery group, whatever it is. The problem is you need 60 or 70 or 80 data points. Okay? Now, our approach is that we generate and produce and uncover all of these data points. And I would argue that these aren't nice to have. These aren't something to make management giggle. These are absolute hard requirements at time of disaster if you're going to have the optimal recovery. Okay? Now, you can look at this and get scared and say, holy smokes, you know, we just spent 12 months doing a BIA and we got 6 data points. How long is it going to take us to do this? Well, that goes to the process too. Our approach does everything a BIA is purported to do. It does it with far more detail, far more accuracy, far less impact on your people in a fraction of the time, okay? But yet produces all this information, which is critical at time of disaster. So those are the 10 critical flaws. We got a bonus flaw for you.
Hey, Bill.
Yeah.
Before you go much further, you may not be able to answer this question now, but it would be good to help us out. Those of us that have absolutely no budget and can't afford to buy a nice tool, like I know you're going to share with us later, how can we take any suggestions on how we can take this approach and apply it to our business without a special tooling behind it to power it?
Well, that's a really good question. Let me think about that for a second. First of all, let me go back a slide. I think that absent this issue, the details, I think most everything that we've talked about you can address without a specialized tool. Now, admittedly, I think you need a specialized tool to get this data and to do something with it once you've got it. But I don't think you need a specialized tool to identify outliers. Maybe a little more time to do it manually, but if you look for outliers from whatever data you have, you'll find your outliers. And if you look for cross-process dependencies, add a few more questions to your interviews or to your questionnaires. We don't really believe in questionnaires, but to your interviews. And you'll identify those cross-dependencies. So I think if you look at most of the other recommendations and you say, how do I build that into my process, I think you'll find a reasonable way to do that. This one, I think, may stay out of reach just because almost by definition you need a tool to do this.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so like I say, a bonus, BIA reports are reports. They're static reports. And a static report has problems associated with it. Not the fact only that tomorrow it's probably out of date, but it doesn't answer questions. Maybe if you flip through enough pages and dig deep enough, maybe you can answer some of these questions. But wouldn't it be nicer to have that data available at the push of a button that answers all these questions for you dynamically on the fly for the disaster of today? I think technology allows you to do that. And when I say that, there's all sorts of technology BIA tools out there, database tools that reproduce 57 or 357 reports for you. That's not what I'm talking about. We've used to produce all sorts of reports, and quite honestly, we found in our tabletop exercises that nobody could use those reports. They were just, no matter how detailed, how structured, how specifically aligned to the scenario they were, people couldn't deal with it. So we said, all right, we're slow learners maybe, but we learn. So we changed the rules, and we said, okay, we're not going to produce reports. We're going to produce your plan at time of disaster. Push the button, and we will tell you step by step what to do explicitly for today's disaster. So those are what we think are the major critical fatal flaws in a traditional BIA. And it gets worse. I mean, we could talk about this, I think, for hours, and the list goes on and on and on. But I think we're going to save that for another day. we go back to where we started. Why do you want to do a BIA? We said to identify critical business processes. I say it's to identify and prioritize critical business processes and to understand how and when they deteriorate as a function of time. It's very different. To identify recovery objectives, well, I say to identify and correlate critical processes to applications and to identify the interdependencies. We call that resultant criticalities. We said you do a BIA to define how many people and resources are needed. Clearly, you need to know how many people and resources are needed, but you also need to know when and where those people and resources are needed, and most BIAs won't help you with that. To get the business to own the problem, we think it's to make the workforce more knowledgeable about continuity. And to identify financial losses caused by process interruption and to use those losses to get management's commitment. I have yet to see, in 35+ years of doing this, a single instance where if we go to management and show them that we've reduced their costs and improved the operational recovery with a more responsive solution, I've never seen management not support the process. So I think there is a better way, and I hope that I've communicated to you some of the problems with a traditional BIA. And to Alice's last question, I think you can apply a lot of this to your process internally without our tool set. And it's going to require a change of mind, but I think it's doable. And I think once you do it, if you do it, you'll walk away with a completely different understanding of what's important to your company. So I think that's it. Alice, do we want to, did you get any questions along the way?
I'll check with Jody. I left a check. There hadn't been any additional questions, but I do encourage you guys to ask questions because we have Bill on the line now, and he's ready to answer any questions you might have. So I know Jody will give me a chime in if a question comes into her. But as we said before, you know, you can't take this information and apply it to your programs today. It's asking those questions and getting in, as you're identifying those outliers and the cross dependencies that you may not have already identified in your program. So really rethinking those questions that you ask as you go through the BIA process. Because at the end of the day, that's what we're doing, right, is we're asking our business questions and having them give us answers back and helping them to assess where the risks are for the business. Have you had any other typical questions that you get asked by other customers when you present this information to them?
Well, one of them, I guess, that we are almost categorically asked, you know, I think people look at these flaws, starting with a little bit of a jaundiced eye. I'm not sure that everybody inherently believes these, but I think most of the time after they think about them, they do. And I know every time we actually do our alternative, which we call an IBPD, an iterative business process decomposition, every time we do an IBPD with someone, they almost invariably come back to us and say, you know, I've been doing this for years, and this is the best view of my process criticality that I've ever seen. But I think a question that's always either asked or waiting to be asked is, how can I possibly get all this detail in all these specifics in a reasonable amount of time? You know, because like I say, if you spend 6 or 12 months doing a BIA, if you spend hours and hours with a department trying to find out what they need, or they spend hours filling out a form, and I'm saying you need 10 times as much data, that's scary for most people. But again, if it's done right, and we'll show you a little bit of that in just a second here, and if you ask the right questions, it's really faster and less painful. To put it into a specific context, generally speaking, we can get all this kind of information from an operating department in less than an hour. And that's back to those 80 data points. Okay? Very rarely does a BIA take less than an hour per department. So it's a combination of the methodology, the approach, understanding what you're looking for, and to those data points, a tool. But it doesn't have to bury the business. And as a matter of fact, I would say the more you are burying the business, the more likely you are to have less accurate results because, quite honestly, they just sign out.
Cool. Well, it looks like we have no additional questions at this time, but if you would like to start the demo now, that would be great. And everyone, please go ahead and you send the question to me or Jody if you have it while we're going through the demo, and we'll stay on until the demo is completed.
I want to thank everybody for their time and their attention. And like I say, folks, if you come up with any questions after the fact, or if you want to see this any more detail, you now know where we live. We'd love to hear from you. Thank you very much.